I want to talk about the Lost Colony of Roanoke, and more broadly the voyages of Sir Walter Raleigh in the 1580s that were the first contact between the natives of North America and the English. It's a fascinating story, one that's been trampled on by the romantic tale of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, or the English colony off to a smooth start that disappeared. A more faithful telling, though, is actually more riveting. Historians aren't generally the ones to blame here. It's the popularization of history with the fetishing of unsolved mysteries and the notion that uncertainty is a problem. I tell the story in 4 parts. I've read the primary source materials associated with these voyages. There's not that much. I've also read several books, treatments of others. Importantly, in areas where those books diverge, I stick my head deep right back into the primary source materials. The rest of this video is part 1. I hope you enjoy it. Where and when are we talking about? If there's anything unique about my treatment, it's the attention to space and time. Here's New York, here's Florida, we're talking halfway in between. If we expand this area, we get a view of the outer banks of North Carolina. The highlighted area is modern-day Dare County. It's about 70 miles top to bottom and has 38,000 people. Here's where the Wright brothers flew their first plane. Here's Oregon Inlet, where the Wicked Tuna Outer Banks fishing boats go and come. The water on the right is the Atlantic Ocean. The water on the inside is expanses of shallow water that we call sounds. And for what it's worth, I live here. Much of what happens in the Roanoke Voyages in the 1580s occurs right in this region. Island in the middle is about 10 miles long and 2 miles wide. That's Roanoke Island. Here's a timeline for perspective. If now is all the way on the left, you see here World War II, you see the Civil War a century and a half ago, you see the U.S. Revolution, and then well before that, you see the Plymouth and Jamestown colonies. And a generation before Jamestown, you see the Roanoke Voyages. So basically, if you go back from now to the time of the U.S. Revolution, and then almost that same distance back again, that's the 1580s. Here's Columbus in the 1490s, and for this century, Spain is decimating the populations of South and Central America, has influence into Florida, is getting quite rich, and is the predominant world power. England, Queen Elizabeth at this time, lacks resources to do what Spain is doing, but desperately wants to establish a foothold in North America. The Queen enlists basically venture capitalists, and through public-private partnership plans what are now called the Roanoke Voyages. Turns out because of prevailing currents and winds, this is pretty much the route for all European ships. Down to Africa, over to the Caribbean, up the east coast of the US and Canada, and back to Europe. The planning for the Roanoke Voyages focuses on this area. Motivations for doing these voyages for the investors is a return on their investment, which can come from mining metals like copper and silver and gold, from trading with the native population, and from raiding Spanish ships coming up the coast on the way back to Europe that are filled with valuable stuff. Protestant England is not quite at war with Catholic Spain, but it's close, and Queen Elizabeth would be delighted by anything that hurts the Spanish, pirating included. The first voyage in 1584 is a reconnaissance mission to get the lay of the land and scout out the area looking for a place to establish a military colony. The second voyage is that military colony, and it was plagued with problems from the start, and though it was there for a year, it failed. The third voyage was an attempt to establish a permanent colony that included planters and some families. That too failed. Last was an effort to find out what happened to that 1587 group, and that failed as well. If we look at these on a timeline where you can see the length of each year, you can see that the 1584 voyage was basically a blip in the middle of the year because they're only there in the New World for 3 to 4 weeks. The military colony lasts about a year, from the summer of 85 to the summer of 86. The permanent colony started summer of 87, and there's only about 4 weeks that we know anything about what they were doing. Finally, the effort to find out what happened to them was very brief and 3 years later. I'll talk about them in turn, starting with the exploratory voyage. The voyage had 2 modest ships captained by Barlow and Amadas. In the early part of July, they puttered along the coast looking for an inlet. We can't say for sure where they anchored, but we know it was close to here because the next few weeks have many interactions with the people of a town here, one day, next day, next day, next day. And they also visited this town, and near as we can tell, nowhere else. So we'll expand this area and take a closer look. This here is present-day Oregon Inlet, and somewhat a little above that was an inlet from back then, often called Hatteras, and later Port Fernando or Port Fernando. Barlow refers to the distance from the anchored boats to the native town on the north end of Roanoke Island as 7 leagues, with the Anglo-French Marine League at the time would be about 19 miles. You can see this is 18 miles, so that's close. But it can't be discounted. The ships could have been anchored 7 leagues in the other direction from the town, which would have been an inlet near modern-day Duck that they later called Trinity Harbor. Everything we know about what happened here comes from Barlow's report, which is massaged by others and published years later. It has parts that appear like a contemporaneous journal and parts that don't. It includes information that would have been learned from 2 native people who returned to England with Barlow. Their names were Wanchese and Manio, just like you see on Google Maps here. There's a note in the margin they claimed the land for the Queen July 13th, so it appears they first anchored here mid-July. They're back in England mid-September, and they have about a 5-week trip back, so they're not here all that long. They hang around the ships and see nobody until the 3rd day when they see 3 men in a canoe. And the day after that, there's an entourage of 40 to 50 men with a leader, Grand Jamestown. If the 3 men in the canoe were scouts, they would have had to paddle back the 18 miles, give word that the visitors were friendly, and the entourage would have 18 miles to paddle to get to the ships. So the entourage getting there the next day is pretty aggressive. 18 miles is probably 2/3 of a day worth of paddling. There's lots of trading, lots of interaction, lots more paddling because Grand Jamestown comes back with his wife and children. Grand Jamestown's wife comes back many times, followed by 40 to 50 women, and the natives are soon delivering food every day. The English seem to stay put, except for a group that goes exploring, presumably in the Albemarle Sound, and on the 2nd night they pay a visit to the Roanoke town. There seems to be visitors to the ships from many towns because Barlow says they came from all parts with stuff to trade. We later learn that there are many towns within approximately 2 days by canoe, so we don't know who they might have interacted with, but here are some examples. Each of these towns would have about 200 to 250 people living in longhouses. There might be 10 or a dozen longhouses, and they hold about 20 people each. They grow corn and a few other crops in small fields in thin soil that gets spent, so they need to slash and burn a new field. They catch crabs and they trap fish in fence-like structures called weirs. They hunt bear, deer, and rabbits, and they gather nuts and berries. In short, their food sources are complex and seasonal, probably keep the town populations at a level commensurate with the local environment. The towns seem sometimes to be more or less independent, sometimes to have allegiances that may come and go, and sometimes to be in conflict. We learn there's a significant leader named Wingina in a town called Dasamankapuk on the mainland close to Roanoke Island, and he's actually the brother of Grand Jamestown. Seems like Wingina is revered and might carry some influence over a pretty broad range here. There's talk of mortal war with what looks like this region. There's another alignment over here. And then there's a significant leader named Menatonan on the upper Chuan River who seems to know a lot about major trading routes to the west and north. Barlow's report on the natural resources of the area was over-the-top glowing to the point of being ridiculous. That's reason to be at least cynical of his reports of interaction with the native population. When we think of impactful partnerships in history, Watson and Crick, DNA, Orville and Wilbur, Unlocking the Secrets of Flight, Lennon and McCartney, Songwriting, the remarkable collaboration between Harriet and Manio might be on this list. Little is known about Manio, one of the natives who returned with Barlow and spent 7 months in England. It's not mentioned in 1584, but we later learn he was from Croatoan, 50 miles south of Rome. More is known about Harriet, a lot of it learned pretty recently. The world has come to realize it's not unreasonable to talk about Harriet in the same breath as Galileo and Newton and Descartes. He didn't intend to publish his work, and we now realize he made major contributions well before the people typically credited with these things in optics, astronomy, navigation, map-making, algebra, and linguistics. Harriet was a young Oxford grad who took the best mathematics, the best navigational instruments, and the best astronomy, and developed a course for the sea captains of the Roanoke Voyages. Here, besides Harriet's work on the ethnography of the Carolina Algonquian population, Harriet and Manio learned to communicate with one another in a matter of months, which is amazing. And Harriet actually goes on the next voyage, the 1585 voyage. And we're now ready to talk about that voyage, but first let's review some of the key people and places. Barlow and Amadas anchor somewhere near Roanoke Island because they interact a lot with the people from the town on the north end of that island, and they actually visit that town. Big ships can't go into the Sound, so they anchor at an inlet by the ocean. The leader from the town is Gran Janemio, and we'll hear from him again. The English don't seem to know it, but there's another significant town right across the way, and it's called Dasamankapug. It has an even more significant leader named Wingina, who it turns out is Gran Janemio's brother, and we will definitely hear more about him. The two natives who returned to England were Wanchese and Manio. Wanchese is from the Roanoke area, and Manio is from Croatoan. We don't know whether Manio was one of the natives who came up to trade with the visitors, or if he was already in the Roanoke area. We later learn people from Croatoan are up in the Roanoke area. So we're now ready to join Harriet, Manio, and 600 other people as they set sail 7 months later.